I think there is a very strong understanding between Israel and Russia about Israel's freedom of action in Syria. At the same time, I think that there have been very difficult challenges, and you've talked about the elution, that force us to make extra efforts to improve our communication. I think one of the things that we miss in all this discussion about Iran, Russia, Israel, is the fact that I think the Iranians and the Russians are not natural allies. I believe that one of the underlying assumptions of the Russian intervention and the permission they give to the Iranians to be there is that the Russian conflict is with the Sunni Muslims. That's the way they see it. It's the Sunni Muslims and the Sunni states that have supported the Mujahideen in the Caucasus, and that's their central problem. So if they are in conflict with these organizations or with countries that support them, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, they're addressing their number one national security concern. Iran isn't their concern. But I think that's a huge mistake they're making, because a study by any sort of college level student of the Middle East would lead such a person to understand that the Shia extremists in Iran have been supporting Sunni extremists for years, and the policy of going after Sunni states and propping up or supporting the Shia intervention in Syria, that policy can boomerang against Russia. And I know I'm going a little off topic, but I think this is a very important fundamental element. And in my communications with Russians, I oftentimes would go into these details. And it was interesting, the responses. It wasn't an alien argument. It was an argument that they could understand.
How did they respond?
Well, I can't get into that.
Well, it's here between friends.
I can give you just a sense. I think they understood that there's a problem there. And they didn't speak about Iran as a country with similar values, or as a country that they are so firmly allied with.
But I'm not talking about shared values. I'm talking about, realpolitik. Because if the ultimate goal of Russia is to preserve Syria as an influence region or state under Russia influence, then if the Iranians are helping this goal, then they are cooperating with them, and they're not ready to resent them for that.
A lot depends on your analysis of why the Russians are in Syria. Are they in Syria because they want to show the world and show the Arab world as well that, unlike the United States with Mubarak, they don't abandon their allies? Valid theory number one. Could be. It could be that they have other motivations to reestablish their global position vis-a-vis the United States.
For whatever reason, they need the Iranian in order to reach this goal.
But if their goal, and I'll give you the third goal is because the Chechen and other Mujahideen from the Trans-Caucasus have gotten involved in these conflicts and have been involved in Syria. And so for them, a victory of jihadi Islam in Syria, from their perspective, will affect their security directly.
If they are not allies, and maybe even some of their interests are in conflict, then again, why doesn't Russia, why the Russians do not restrain the Iranians when they see, even in the mind of how to calm things down, it does not serve the Russians that the Israeli Air Force keep on attacking Iranians in Syria. Following your logic, we should expect the Russian to say the Iranians stop, and we don't see it.
I think something is going to happen that will shift the Russian policy at some point. But I can't say when, and I can't say what it is. But I can say that these are not allies that are locked together for cooperation for the long term. I think something is going to separate them from one another. There are many issues that are on our agenda between the United States and Israel, not just the question of Syria. If you want me to focus on that, that's possible. But we're now on the verge of a Trump initiative which will be released after the American elections.
Mm-hmm.
And it will have a number of details. Israeli elections, excuse me.
Yeah.
It will have a number of details which will be subjects where there'll be agreement and disagreement. So that certainly is an area where the two sides can discuss after the Israeli elections. As far as Syria goes,
Just a second, I interrupt you. Do you believe that the Trump peace plan
yes,
would be something that even remotely the Palestinians would agree to, in terms of that for Bibi Netanyahu, if Trump don't get the green light from Abbas and the Palestinians, then he doesn't have to bother. Now, given what we know about the Trump administration, what the chances that he will put on the table an initiative, a peace plan that can meet the minimum requirements of the Palestinians, so Bibi will have to, to address it, to face it, to confront it.
look, I'm not getting into the content of the plan because we don't know the content of the plan, so it's sort of a pointless discussion. But what is, I think, very clear is that the agenda of U.S.-Israel relations will be very full of rich details that are connected to the plan. And so that's going to be the area of, can you help me, can you not help me?
Mm-hmm.
Now, as far as Syria goes, if the United States is pulling out of Syria, it's somewhat limited in what it can do there to shape the nature of the settlement. Now, there's been this mystery about Tanif, because sometimes you see reports that Tanif is not included in the American withdrawal, and sometimes you see that it's all American forces. Now, there's only 200 troops that have been deployed in Tanif, but it's a critical area because it's on this connecting route between Baghdad and Damascus, and it's an area. It's a way of moving from Baghdad to Damascus without having to cross the Euphrates River. It's of tremendous value to Iran. So those forces there, although 200 troops, don't amount to much in number, but we used to call that a tripwire back in the days of the Cold War. And if the Iranians start playing around with American troops, they're going to trigger a very powerful American response. What is going to be the Israeli ask in Syria? Obviously, we'll still be pushing towards two things: getting Iran out and making sure that the Russians don't conflict with our operations in the air in Syria. What the U.S. can do if it has reduced its forces isn't entirely clear. The president did make a statement that he sees the U.S. forces in Iraq as a lever, as a power that could be used in struggling with future scenarios in Syria.
That was perceived as a reaction to the criticism he faced back home about his decision to withdraw from Syria. So he kind of went to a trip to Iraq and said, "Oh, we're going to stay here forever."
Well, policy and foreign policy isn't something you can just sort of, as we say in our language, lishlof. It's not something you can just sort of pull out of your hat. And therefore, these things have to be I believe, somewhat thought through. And I don't think that that was said without any consideration of what American policy would be. I just want to say one thing also about Russia and Iran in Syria, and it relates to this whole thing. Russia is more of a status quo power, meaning it achieved what it hoped to achieve. And it wants to preserve what it achieved in Syria. The Iranians are still a revolutionary power. And they're not only just employing their own forces, but the big story in Syria are the Shia militias, which of course come from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and they are there to upset the apple cart, which is not the Russian interest. If Russia's achievements will be put at risk because of Iranian policy, I see a serious conflict.
But it has already happened. I mean, the Israeli Air Force attack in Syria constantly, over and over again, put in danger the main goal of the Russians to stabilize Syria. And yet the Russians are not putting a red card in front of the Iranian, maybe because of what Amos said, they just cannot do it. It's not in their capabilities.
Look, timing in international diplomacy is one of the hardest factors to predict. But there's an inherent conflict between these two sides, although they are defined as allies, and at some point it's going to come to be expressed. That's what I said earlier.
Thank you. Dan Shapiro,